My name is Brian Jack, and I'm the Interim Director of the Black Studies Program and Associate Professor of Historical Studies here at SIUE, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's lecture. Co-sponsored by Black Studies and Historical Studies, today's program is part of the Organization of American Historians Distinguished Lectureship Program, where the nation's top historians share their expertise with the public. Today's speaker should be familiar to some of you, and we're so happy to have him back here at SIUE. Dr. Clarence Lang is Dean's Professor of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at the University of Kansas. Dr. Lang is Chair of the Department of African and African American Studies and Interim Director of the Hall Center for the Humanities. He earned his BA in Journalism from the University of Missouri at Columbia, his MA in History from Historical Studies from Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, keep on cougering, and his PhD in History from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He's the author of 2 books, Black America in the Shadow of the 60s, Notes on the Civil Rights Movement, Neoliberalism and Politics, and Grassroots at the Gateway, Class Politics and Black Freedom Struggle in St. Louis, 1936 to 1975. That's one I use in a bunch of my classes, and I actually just recommended it to a colleague the other day, too. I love that. A prolific scholar, Professor Lang is co-editor of 2 other books, Anti-Communism and the African American Freedom Movement, Another Side of the Story, and Reframing Randolph, Labor, Black Freedom, and the Legacies of A. Philip Randolph. His work has also appeared in such venues as the Journal of African American History, Journal of Social History, Journal of Urban History, The Black Scholar, Race and Society, Journal of Civil and Human Rights, New Politics, The Chronicle of Higher Ed, American Studies Journal, Labor Online, and Critical Sociology. Today's lecture by Dr. Lang, as you can see, is Black History and Studies from Obama to Trump, Reflections on the Shadow of the 60s. Please welcome Dr. Clarence Lang.
Hey, good afternoon. Can you hear me? Okay. My inside voice is an outside voice, but I know I have to be mic'd up. So I wanted to take a moment to thank and acknowledge a few people. First and foremost, I want to thank the Black Studies Program and its director, Brian Jack, for that introduction, and then also for his role in sponsoring my visit here. I want to thank the Department of Historical Studies for their role, that department's role in hosting my visit, and give a particular word of thanks and acknowledgement to some individuals in the room today who helped to train, groom, mentor, advise, and befriend me when I was a graduate student in the Department of Historical Studies and later a lecturer. So Shirley Portwood, Steve Tamari, Rowena McClinton. And finally, let me thank all of you for showing up for this event. So I want to do sort of a few things. I want to give you a talk that's thoughtful, that is, if you don't mind the word, scholarly, but also is an effort to engage you. So I hope that you all will work with me. And I'm going to try not to bore you, but if I do, don't blame me. Blame the Department of Historical Studies. We help the training. So, the title of my talk today is Black History and Studies from Obama to Trump, Reflections on the Shadow of the 60s. And the broad points of, we'll let this. There we go. So the broad points are drawn from a book that I published a few years ago entitled Black America in the Shadow of the 60s. And my main argument in that book is that the constant comparison between our contemporary moment in the 1960s, or what I'm going to call the 60s, not only distorts that past, but it also substitutes for political creativity and imagination today. Now, at the outset, I should say that, as someone who was born at the tail end of the 1960s, I spent most of my adolescence and young adulthood kind of always grappling with the legacies of that. And people who were Gen Xers, as we were called, you would know what I'm talking about. Maybe you millennials don't have quite that same relationship to that period, but it was always kind of the elephant in the room as I was growing up. And I think in light of some things that have happened over the past couple of years, people are talking about the 60s again in renewed kinds of ways. And my intervention into that conversation is to say that we have to be careful about how we do that, because there's violence that we can do to that past in terms of distorting it, but also we can take what we think are accurate lessons, but actually are not, and that do us a disservice in terms of how we address today. So that was my intervention in that particular project. So in the case of something like Black Lives Matter, for example, the persistence of the 60s as a constant point of reference, a constant signifier, can obscure, this is my argument, both the challenges and opportunities that face us right now in a new millennium, in the 21st century. In short, what I'm saying as someone who's trained as a historian who understands that history is actually important to the contemporary moment, because history is always about shadow boxing with the present. So when people are talking about the past, they're really talking about the present. And my point is that while it's appropriate, and I think even healthy, to look to the past in order to grapple with the present, resorting to a 60s framing can have negative consequences for how we might understand the prospects for transformative Black politics in the here and now. That's at least my subjective interest in the transformative Black politics in the here and now. This is a point that I want to develop. But I also want to explore how Black Studies, which was founded in the 60s, also speaks to today. But first, I need to begin by giving you some background about myself as a scholar. My research and teaching interests concern Black urban communities in the U.S. Midwest, in this region, and African American social movements in particular, including the Civil Rights Movement, Black Power movement of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And I consider myself part of a wave of contemporary scholars, some of whom that you've probably been exposed to in your classes, if you've taken courses with Dr. Jack and others. I'm part of a wave of scholars who are challenging popular narratives of the post-World War II Civil Rights Movement by reassessing such matters as who led the movement, right, who participated in it, when it occurred, where it occurred, and what the movement aimed to accomplish. All right? So, for example, in contrast to the standard narrative in which the movement was led by Baptist ministers, lawyers, other members of the respectable Black middle class, scholars have turned their attention to the central role played by domestic workers, by common laborers, by unemployed youth, by public housing tenants, and other people who, because they were working class, they were women, or very often both, have remained invisible in civil rights history, at least until very recently. In the same manner, scholars have moved from a national narrative of the movement, and by that I mean a narrative focused on organizations like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, led by Martin Luther King Jr., or the American presidency, to more regional and local narratives. And this is really important, because when we go from the national narrative to the local, seeing what people did in local communities, we understand the Civil Rights Movement was a local movement. It was a national movement made up of local struggles. We're able to more easily identify the grassroots foot soldiers, the men, the women, the youth, who work with their hands, who were working class, who didn't have degrees, but who actually did the daily work of the movement. All right? And this pushes the conversation beyond the leadership of a single heroic individual, usually male, whether we're talking about Martin Luther King Jr., John F. Kennedy, or Lyndon B. Johnson. Going to the grassroots, as I call it, significantly also allows us to capture the long-range struggles that local Black communities waged for freedom rights outside of the classical time period that's come to define the Civil Rights Movement. And by the classical framework, I mean the beginning, right, 1954, right, Brown versus Board of Education ruling, ending in 1965, the passage of the Voting Rights Act. That's a classical time period. But there are scholars who are pushing those boundaries for us to look earlier and to continue the conversation later, okay? And likewise, historians of the Civil Rights Movement have turned their lenses from the South, reminding us that we can't overlook the struggles that occurred in places like Los Angeles, Oakland, New York City, Philadelphia, Chicago, Milwaukee, Detroit, St. Louis, East St. Louis, as well as Birmingham, Alabama, and the Mississippi Delta. Do you understand what I'm saying? That oftentimes the narrative of the Civil Rights Movement is a Southern narrative which ignores the fact that any place in the United States during this period where you had a black population, you had a movement. On whatever side of the Mason-Dixon line you were on. And given the fact that the civil rights movement, the civil rights struggles occurred in the U.S. North as well as in the South, we've had to more closely consider the diverse, wide-ranging goals of that movement. I think those of us who do this work have long battled the perception that the civil rights movement was simply the fight for people to realize individual, market-based liberties over group-based social democratic rights. But I think when we expand the regional scope of the movement and we understand that it occurred across the nation, we find that activist demands included not only access to lunch counters, which is a story that's often told, or being able to sit where they wanted to sit on the bus, both of which were important demands, but also better employment and economic opportunity. Not just the right to vote, and hear me on this point, not just simply the right to vote, but also the power to meaningfully choose political representation. Not just equitable education, but also equitable health care. Not just open and fair housing, but also the ability to substantively shape urban planning and development policy. Not just equal protection under the law as an abstract principle, but also concrete action to curb police misconduct and abuse rampant in black communities, both northern and southern. And because of this, there are many people who argue that even the term, the civil rights movement, doesn't do justice to the wide-ranging goals that activists fought for, and that in fact we need new nomenclature, we need new terms. So there are a number of scholars who turn to the term the Black Freedom Movement, or Black Freedom Struggles. Okay? And my own work has reflected these multiple trends in the literature. The subject of my first book, Grassroots at the Gateway, which initially began as a big lumbering MA thesis that I wrote when I was a history graduate student here at SIUE. Shirley Portwood was on the committee, so she remembers this. It's available in the archives in this building, in the library, it's still there. 300 pages or more. I mean, it was just, anyway. But I did something with it, so it made it into a book. So that project, again, which began here, concerned black community and social movements in St. Louis, Missouri. And I used St.Louis as a case study to develop the following argument that I want to run out for you very quickly. What I argued in that book is that between the 1930s to the late 1960s and early 1970s, working class African Americans occupy the center of local black freedom struggles for fair and full employment, expanded social wages in the form of health care and education, a racially democratic labor movement, meaningful electoral participation and representation, and equitable urban development policies. And I argue that these battles generated both cooperation and conflict between black working class and black middle class activists. What I argue, though, is that working class constituencies largely defined and directed the movement's political and economic agendas during this period. And I'm going to make an argument in a moment for why that particular point is important. I contended that as a result of industrial decline, the resulting collapse in urban tax bases that we've seen in Chicago and St. Louis and other places, and the government-sponsored repression of the movement's most progressive and radical forces, the strength of this black working class politics declined in the late 1970s. That's Detroit, not St. Louis, but you get my point. That had social and political consequences as well as economic consequences. And what I argue is that the political vacuum instead was filled by a burgeoning post-1960s black middle class that was rooted in the professions, business enterprise, and most visibly electoral politics. You all know who that is? Who's that? I was looking for the students. Bill Clay, right? William Clay, all right? Congressperson from Missouri. Important figure. So part of what I sought to do in my book was to better comprehend the simultaneous emergence of a post-civil rights black middle class, of which I count myself a member in terms of how I grew up, on the one hand, and the expansion at the exact same moment of a so-called black underclass, right, we saw occurring in the 1980s and 90s. That I lived long enough that I sort of came of age during a period where you saw on the one hand, it's going to sound it's going to sound silly, simultaneously the Cosby Show and Boys in the Hood. And that those two realities were simultaneous and that they existed. And part of my work has been trying to figure out how did those two things emerge after the 1960s, after the Civil Rights Movement at the same time. Okay. Now, let me say a bit more about this term, the underclass, and especially the dirty work that this concept has been used to accomplish politically. And this is where I need you all to hang with me, because I think the point of scholarship is to try and get a handle on and apprehend reality, to deal with complexities in order to make them simple. So I'm going to ask for your patience and your indulgence. This is really important, I think, to where we are right now, in my view. So this was a term that entered popular usage in the 1970s, the underclass. This was a term that was used primarily to describe those who existed at the lowest rungs of the socioeconomic ladder. The term has functioned more as an ideological device than as a real sociological category. And what I mean by that is this. What it was used to do, this term, the underclass, was to shift attention from structural. I got to stop. Anthony Cheeseborough just came in. Good to see you. Thanks for coming. All right. So, another person really significant to my time here. This is like a homecoming. So, where was I? The underclass. It was used to shift attention from issues of structural inequalities of race, class, and gender toward a focus on the pathology, the cultural pathology of the black working poor. Okay, and you've heard this argument. As the argument went, the underclass existed because of its members' deviance, dysfunction, and dependence on government programs. Okay, that the poor are poor because they have bad values. They have bad values. They're poor. The wheel goes round and round. Accordingly, these were not problems that social welfare expenditures could remedy. In fact, the argument has gone, such expenditures only reinforce dependency of the underclass. And where I'm headed with this is that the discourse, what I call the discourse of the underclass, made possible a turn from social welfare as an organizing principle of social policy to punishment, or what some scholars have termed the punitive turn in U.S. social policy. And this has conditioned broad segments of society across class and across race to justify and even promote the elimination of social safety net measures and democratic freedoms, even at their own expense. And this has had an effect on everyone, but it's had a particularly devastating, stigmatizing consequence for working class communities of color, the same working class communities of color that, I argue, propelled the major black social movements of the 20th century. A good example of this has been the war on drugs, out of which has come harsh mandatory minimums for drug offenses, crack cocaine, associated with the black working class poor, racial profiling, attacks on Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches and seizures, the militarization of local police and black working class community spaces, the mass incarceration of what? Some 2.3 million people, many of them for nonviolent drug offenses, a disproportionate number of them people of color, and pervasive assumptions of black criminality. Hang on to that term, the black underclass. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. So that's going to make a reappearance. And needless to say, as someone who has studied St. Louis, and as someone who, I've not added yet, but I'll add now, was politically involved in that city while a graduate student at this institution, I followed with close interest the mass demonstrations that began in Ferguson, Missouri, following the police shooting death of 18-year-old Michael Brown during a pedestrian stop in August 2014. In April 2015, civil unrest erupted in another border South city like St. Louis, Baltimore, Maryland, this time in response to the death of another black male, 25-year-old Freddie Gray, following a police arrest. All of these activities and more, some of them organized, others of them occurring more spontaneously, have cohered generally under the signature of Black Lives Matter. I was commenting to, if you permit me, just a quick divergence to Dr. Jack, because I did a little bit of research to prepare myself to come back. And I see on this campus you all have had like not one, not two, but 3 Black Lives Matter conferences. And I would say there was no way in hell that would have happened at the University of Kansas where I am now. We might have been able to get by with one, but certainly not 3 times. So that tells things have changed, right? So that's occurred. Like many others around the nation affected by these developments, I participated in local community vigils in Lawrence, Kansas, where I currently reside, marches, public forums, even the 2014 Ferguson October mobilization that occurred in St. Louis. Moreover, as a scholar who writes and teaches about U.S. black social movements in the 20th century, I was also conscious of how quickly observers reached back to the recent past in order to make sense of the present. News commentators, academics, even the protesters themselves compared that moment, this moment, to the 1960s, or rather the 60s, with particular reference to the African-American social movements associated with civil rights and black power. Okay? You all with me so far? You doing okay? Okay. Because I'm going to shift gears for a second on you, okay? What do I mean by the 60s? One obvious way to understand it is chronologically, right? The sequence of events occurring between 1960 and 1969. But it clearly is more than that. When you hear the term the 60s, there are all kinds of things that I imagine for many of you, if not most of you, come to mind. Historians use the 60s as a historical category to signify the dramatic, rapid political, economic, social, and cultural transformations that occurred between the mid-1950s and the mid-1970s. Bracketed on one end by the Montgomery bus boycott and the Afro-Asian Conference in Banda, Indonesia, both in 1955. And on the other end, Watergate and the end of the U.S. war in Vietnam, all of which had occurred by 1975. To quote the late historian Arthur Marwick, the 1960s were a time in which, quote, all authority systems, all power relationships, open or concealed, real or imagined, were subject to the most intensive scrutiny, end quote, in a general atmosphere of, quote, idealism, protest, and rebellion. And certainly in the United States, expectations about perpetual economic growth and prosperity. So the key developments of the 60s included the cultural impact of the post-World War II baby boom, changes in family relationships and personal lifestyles, i.e. free love, the pervasiveness of media spectacle. What do I mean by when I say media spectacle? I mean that, you know, for those of you who you tweet and Snapchat, things have become a spectacle. But the 60s is a moment where we see that really develop. So whether you talk about protest demonstrations, music festivals, Woodstock, Altamont, assassinations, the waging of a U.S. war in Vietnam, these things all occurred in public. Okay, we take that for granted now that you can take out your phone and you can film things in real time. But the 60s is a moment where this is a period of media spectacle. That's one of the things that characterizes that period. Certainly also challenges to the U.S. Cold War policies to contain the threat of Soviet communism at home and abroad, and the struggles, this is very important, the struggles for freedom and independence that people of color fought, not just domestically in the United States, but also in Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, and Latin America. So if we understand the 60s based on a coherent set of political, social, and economic and cultural characteristics, we can conceptualize it as a phenomenon that begins, ironically, chronologically in the 1950s and ends chronologically in the 1970s. All right? Okay. But why do the 60s persist in our contemporary imagination? There are legitimate, understandable reasons why this has occurred. First, we have to consider the self-regard of the baby boom generation and the baby boomers' dominance in the media and culture industries, but that's ending, right? Okay. So whether we talk about, for example, the show Mad Men, and maybe a lot of these references are going to start to be very, very dated for some of you, particularly students. All of these shows about growing up in the 60s, the Wonder Years, 30-something, which is about baby boomers in their 30s. These films, The Big Chill, or Cooley High. Any of you seen any of those films? Cooley High? Okay, that's my film right there. All right, so takes place in Chicago. I mean, you know, there's a major, I'm sorry I have to do this. There's a major gaffe in that film. If you look at the opening credits, you're going to see in the background the Sears Tower. I'm sorry to ruin it for you, which was not built until 1973. But anyhow, it's a good movie. So, but I just said, okay, I'm the historian. That's what we do. You know, we kind of do that stuff. The Eyes on the Prize, Civil Rights documentary series, Motown 25. I'm really dating myself. This is when Michael Jackson really stepped out of the shadows. He did Billie Jean. So it initially began as a celebration of the history of Motown label, but Michael Jackson did his thing and just like blew everything up. But it was supposed to have been about the 60s, right? I'll Fly Away, the beginning of classic rock radio, that begins in the 80s. And then, of course, there are all these films that came out about the war in Vietnam, and shows, China Beach, Tour of Duty, Platoon, Hamburger Hill, Casualties of War, and also, because I went to a lot of movies in the 80s, there were all these Vietnam revenge fantasies that came out, you know, with people with their shirts off and big guns. Nike sold us tennis shoes to the music of the Beatles, and my uncle liked this. The California Raisin Advisory Board produced commercials featuring a claymation singing group, the California Raisins, crooning Marvin Gaye's classic, I Heard It Through the Grapevine. Made a lot of money, sold a lot of records, by the way. Even in hip-hop music, which was a distinctively post-civil rights development, and I'm really dating myself here, artists frequently sample speeches by Malcolm X and the music of soul brother number one, James Brown. There was no hip-hop in the 1980s without James Brown samples, right? And you can see the iconography, Boogie Down Productions, an album that came out in the late 1980s, clearly an evocation of Malcolm X there. Second, as I mentioned earlier, the 1960s remained one of the most tumultuous eras in recent U.S. history, where seemingly every institution and social relationship experienced a severe crisis, as evident, for instance, in the phenomenon of Black urban rebellions. Indeed, the upheaval that we've seen in Ferguson, Baltimore, Milwaukee, and so on have seemed to mirror the waves of Black revolt that shook the nation in the late 1960s. While striking historical parallels existed between events surrounding the epic desegregation battle that occurred in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, take note, and events in Ferguson. Okay? So there are ways in which there are some very easy parallels that you can make. These parallels included the public spectacle of police responding to demonstrations with intimidation and naked brutality, national and international reportage by embattled journalists receptive to the grievances of resilient marchers, the presence of an obstinate police chief acting in defiance of outside scrutiny, sympathy mobilizations among activists and concerned citizens around the nation, and a reluctant federal intervention into an explosive racial crisis. I should mention here too, that so much of what we know or what we think we know about the 60s is closely intertwined with the civil rights movement of that period. To quote historian Edward P. Morgan, quote, "More than anything else, the civil rights movement galvanized the phenomenon known as the 60s, helping to foster a general climate of sweeping social reforms that broadened the means of freedom and citizenship, including the war on poverty, the right to remain silent, the right to legal counsel, even changes in U.S. immigration policy." Let me be clear, I'm not arguing that everything that we associate with the 60s comes out of what Black people did. That's not my argument. I am making the argument that the struggle that Black people waged in their own interests helped to set the tempo for other reform movements that emerged during that period. That's a really important point. And I'm just going to make it like this. When Black people have organized and mobilized in their interests, whether we're talking about Reconstruction or whether we're talking about the Civil Rights Movement, the benefits of that have not just been felt by Black people. In the obverse, in moments when Black people have experienced setbacks in their citizenship, that has had consequences for the entirety of society too. You understand what I'm saying? So white supremacy is like bad for white folks too, right? And that's a lesson that I don't think we've learned yet. I'll say more about that in a moment too. Certainly the Civil Rights Movement inspired other contemporary U.S. movements, and it foreshadowed their experience and evolution. In other words, the Civil Rights Movement is a critical piece in understanding, if you will, how the 60s became the 60s in our popular imagination. The third reason why the 60s have persisted is that the reality of the first Black U.S. president and the setback represented by the presidency of Donald Trump. Now, I'm very clear that it's a setback. I'm happy to have that conversation during the Q&A. Naturally draws us into conversations about the legacies of post-World War II black freedom struggles in particular, and African American history in general. Okay? If we think about how the 60s has become myth, okay? And that's what the 80s was. It was a moment where the 60s moved from being history to mythology. Obama's presidency in the White House certainly has given deeper resonance to the slew of 50th year anniversaries of events that we have been observing these past few years. I include the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Justice, the 1964 passage of the Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Selma, Alabama voting rights campaign, which was dramatized in the motion picture Selma, and the subsequent passage of the landmark Voting Rights Act, the 1967 urban disturbances that occurred in Newark and Detroit, which were dramatized recently in another motion picture that some of you may have seen, Detroit. And this year, okay, there's a lot of looking back about the Poor People's Campaign and the Memphis Sanitation Workers strike, during which Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. In Kansas City, earlier this week, I was at a demonstration by food service workers, most of whom are female and black and brown folks, who are they're doing a push for better wages and union recognition, and it's all organized around commemorating the 1968 Poor People's Campaign. Okay. The Martin Luther King Jr. Monument in the National Mall and the more recent opening of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, both emerging during the Obama presidency, further compel us to think about the world that the 60s made and where we stand in relationship to that time and how we view and interpret African American history. And certainly the moment since November 2016, and the moment since our last presidential election, I think among many other things puts to lie to the claim that we heard, I think over the past, 9 years or so, that Obama's presidency brought African American history to an end as a chronicle of suffering. If anything, in light of Trump's election, the Obama presidency has demonstrated that periods of perceived black progress have often been followed by periods of white reaction, retrenchment, and violence, which is what we're witnessing right now. And again, to the detriment of not only black people, but also to U.S. society overall. And I want to suggest that the election of 2016 was a culmination of dynamics that we saw even during Obama's presidency. And if you read my book, the 60s book, I have criticisms of Barack Obama, and I'm very clear about those. But I do want to make the point that in 2016, what we saw was a culmination of something that began during his presidency, which was a drift toward, I'm just going to call it fascism in the U.S., as evident in widespread economic inequality, social polarization, where we barely have the basis of a political center at this point in our society, a crisis of governmental legitimacy, populist appeals to white racism, American nationalism, xenophobia, patriarchy, and not to editorialize too much, but I do feel compelled to comment on the fact, if you all permit me another quick divergence, and Brian, you can stop me if this eats up too much of my time, but I do want to say, yesterday we had another school shooting in Florida. And I think that part of how we have to understand how we've gotten to this point, and it's going to sound odd, but work with me. One of the things that happened after the midterm elections was at 2011 or thereabouts, maybe my math is off. The midterm elections during the first Obama presidency. And I say this as someone who lives in the state of Kansas. Right? We saw two things occur when we had a shift to the right. We had one, a restriction of the vote and a loosening of laws governing guns. And I think we have to understand, this is my argument at least, that those things are linked because clearly Obama's presidency was very triggering for a number of folks who saw in it in America that was different than the one that they wanted. That was going to be darker, right? And that was not going to be as Christian. And so the whole mantra of Make America Great Again, we have to understand that as a very racialized discourse. And we have to understand that the proliferation of stand your ground laws that occurred as part of the context in which Trayvon Martin was killed. We have to also understand that as part of the white reaction to what people perceived Obama's presidency represented. And the deeper tragedy of this is that the consequences of this are being felt by everyone. And so what we have are also white children, parents, families, who are collateral damage in this environment as well. Even though it's been animated by, in my head unclear at least, this deep wellspring that we're seeing bubbling up of racial animus. These monuments have also helped to transform the civil rights movement in the 60s more generally, as I mentioned a moment ago, from history to mythology. And this is a vital point because the narratives that we tell about the past influence how we regard the contemporary context. And this applies no less to the 60s. Now it's true today, many decades after the Voting Rights Act, the right to the ballot is far from a settled matter. Recent voter identification laws in Kansas and other states have buttressed forms of voter disenfranchisement. 5 decades after the passage of the Higher Education Act, our institutions of higher learning, and I will begin with mine, still remain spaces that are not fully accessible to students, faculty, and staff of color. Through Title VII, which prohibited employer discrimination, the Civil Rights Act held the promise of greater black economic advancement. Yet, 50 or more years later, a stubborn wealth gap persists between African Americans and their white counterparts. And certainly since the collapse of the housing market in 2007, it is even widened. So from this standpoint, we should look back to the 60s to measure our progress since then. That's legitimate. At the same time, an oversimplified reading of the 60s can generate distorted images and perceptions about this period that misinform the present. So in the case of Ferguson, for instance, too many pundits and spokespersons assume, based on their understanding of this classical civil rights movement led by King and represented by Rosa Parks, that the only legitimate forms of black protest were those led by established male clergy, or that envisioned women as objects of male protection, but never as self-determining actors in their own right, or that center on the perspectives and interests of black community residents who are deemed sufficiently respectable in terms of dress, comportment, diction, education, socioeconomic background, gender norms, and sexuality, or that limit themselves strictly to peaceful methods. This dominant narrative of the 60s also overplays unity as the prevailing feature of African American movements, erasing the rough edges of gender, class, and other intra-racial conflicts that historically have shaped black agendas for social change. What do I mean by that? The point I'm making is that you will see, for those of us who study black social movements, that those movements were internally conflicted around these various kinds of identities. That people didn't just march in unison, but there were monster fights about who should lead, who should follow, around what issues should people organize. Okay? And these things all reflected differences among black people on the basis of class and gender and so forth. And we're certainly seeing, some of that today if we think about what it is to be black in 2018 looks different than what it does in 1958, because we have immigration from the African continent and the Caribbean. Okay. And a fixation on the 60s also avoids reckoning with altogether new forms of racial inequality that have emerged since that time. So things have changed. History is about what remains the same, but it's also about what changes. As Ferguson powerfully illustrated, for instance, racialized poverty has migrated from American inner cities to the older entering suburbs of the nation's metropolitan areas. However, the overarching post-1960s challenge to black families and communities has been, as I mentioned before, the rise of mass incarceration, which gained momentum in the late 1980s with the war on drugs. As Michelle Alexander, Mark Maurer, other scholars have documented, this war has not only filled jail and prison cells disproportionately with people of color, but it has also targeted black communities for police profiling, diminished black life chances, turned many black communities into police-occupied zones, and promoted the lie that the sale, distribution, and consumption of illegal drugs, a national problem, is limited to black, poverty-stricken, working-class communities. I have an exercise in a class that I do oftentimes, and I ask people, if we're talking about drugs, or we talk about crime in a university town, where does most of the crime occur? And people will say, oh, well, East Lawrence, which is kind of like considered like the bad part of the city. And you often have to say, well, actually, in a university town, most of the crime occurs on the campus, right? So whether you're talking about sexual assault or whether you talk about drugs, right? I said that if the ATF were to embark on a raid at the residence hall, they would find all kinds of contraband. But we don't think about university campuses as places of crime. And so our policies are different in that regard. Okay. From this standpoint, the deaths of Jordan Davis, Renisha McBride, Trayvon Martin, Rekia Boyd, Eric Garner, and an ever-growing list of so many others represent more than deadly acts by individuals. Instead, they reflect the low value that punitive laws have placed on black welfare and lives in the new millennium. The connection among black bodies, criminality, and disposability has been so tightly fastened in the white civic imagination, and even sometimes in the black, that in some cases, even civilians, most notoriously George Zimmerman, have felt justified in personally deputizing themselves to profile police and kill black passersby presumed guilty of wrongdoing simply because they are occupying public space. In other instances, notably Ferguson, public officials have used racial profiling for the distinct purposes of economic exploitation. I'm sure with this crowd, I don't have to go through the details of this. Suffice it to say, if you read the 2015 report of the Ferguson Police Department of the U.S. Department of Justice, you will see that that report determined that law officers in the municipal court, at the behest of local government, essentially function as revenue generators for the city through overzealous traffic stops and excessive court fine collections that have buried black residents in catastrophic debt alongside arrest and imprisonment. In light of mass incarceration and its violent aftershocks, failing to fully grapple with post-1960 developments can lead us to overlook, dismiss, or denigrate, I argue, many of those who are actively engaged in Black Lives Matter activist work. This is a problem precisely because much of its rank-and-file participants and some of its emergent leaders are those from those very same segments of Black America, the underclass, I should keep that in mind, that have been most criminalized by war on drugs policies. Many of them are individuals whose verbal skill is rooted more in the cadences of hip-hop than the pulpit, who sport tattoos and dreadlocks, who possess both minimal work histories in the formal economy and extensive jail records for nonviolent offenses, who parent children out of wedlock, or who openly identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or queer. In this sense, Black Lives Matter has helped to bring to the center of black communities groups, social groups, that often have occupied the margins. And for this reason, so that you don't think that I'm just preaching gloom and doom, for this reason, I want to remain optimistic about the current prospects for meaningful social change, perhaps strangely so. If there is any useful lesson that the turbulent 60s can reinforce, it is that moments of crisis are simultaneously moments of opportunity. The protests that we have seen, witnessed, or experienced in places like Ferguson, New York City, Baltimore, Chicago, and elsewhere in the United States signal, or can signal, burgeoning new patterns of mass mobilization that depart from prevailing expectations of middle-class respectability, synonymous with our renderings of the Civil Rights 60s. To quote a colleague of mine down in Merch, the events stemming from places like Ferguson, quote, have helped distinguish the post-civil rights generations from iconic baby boomers because the months of mass protest announced what many of us feel is the most pressing domestic political crisis of our time. That is, the emergence of a massive edifice of policing, surveillance, prisons, and punishment that is unprecedented in both U.S. and global history. And I'm concluding here. And this is where Black studies, I think, can become important. And by Black studies, I mean the intellectual enterprise rooted in the study of the histories, the cultural patterns, the social conditions, the perspectives and activities of African and African-descended people. That's what I mean when I say Black studies. And I think one dramatic development since 2014 has been a wave of student activism and protests that swept the nation beginning in the fall of 2015 at the University of Missouri. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, it was student protests that created Black studies. Today, student protest has provided the opportunity for Black studies, in my view, to restate its relevance in the new millennium, both on the campus and beyond. And what I'm saying is that I think we're at a moment where we have, I'd like to call it an opportunity, a crisis-generated opportunity, but an opportunity nonetheless. We have to ask old questions anew. That is, not just who should have access to institutions of higher education, but also, what is the point of a higher education? Education for what? From a Black studies standpoint, likewise, the task becomes not only to model interdisciplinarity and other forms of scholarly innovation in our core syllabi and research agendas, but also to clarify how scholars ought to inhabit the research that we do in our daily interactions with the larger world. And I'm happy to talk about that in the forthcoming Q&A because it's an issue that I've been thinking a lot about as a Black studies historian, if you will. Further, Black studies is positioned at this moment to not only remind the university of its civic engagement obligations out there, but also to critically engage the internal policies and practices of the university around such issues as the hiring, retention, and success of students, staff, and faculty, the principles of shared faculty, administrative governance, and academic freedom, and the quality of working conditions across all categories of campus-based labor. This is my last sort of divergence, but I want to make this more concrete. When Ferguson first developed, when that first exploded, my university was very quick to put me out front and public as someone who was an expert about African American history in St. Louis. And so they sent out press advisories with my name attached to it. I did interviews with regional, national, and even international media. And as things began, as students began to ask questions about the campus, and when myself and others began to say, okay, well, this is all well and good, but how do we make this thing called Black Lives Matter, matter at KU? No more press releases for yours truly. You know what I mean? The conversation changed. So there's a way in which I think universities can be civically engaged about things that are happening in the broader world, but are not as adept when people want to turn that conversation about, well, how does a university either perpetuate or address issues of inequality? And I think that's part of the task that we have to do, that our dialogue has to not just be about what's happening in the broader world, but also about the spaces that we occupy as students and academics. Black studies at its best can be a vehicle for engaging the present informed by, but not stuck in, Black people's imagined historical past. To be sure, looking to the past for a sense of certitude about the present is a natural impulse. But the fact of the matter is that we will have to figure out the way forward based on present-day terms that confront us. And I'm hopeful that new paradigms of activism and thought will proceed from the conditions of Black life as they actually exist, rather than from an inaccurate imagining of how African Americans pursue the goal of racial justice in a supposedly more glorious past. And this may, I hope, put the 60s in clearer perspective, if not to rest altogether. And I want to thank you all for your time and your attention. I hope I didn't put too much on you at one time. You can see I'm working through a number of things, but I'll stop there and I will welcome and thank you for your comments, questions, and provocations, whatever So, thank you.